There are certain artifacts that defy the comfortable logic of history. They appear in archives not as records of the past, but as intrusions into it. A daguerreotype, a tintype, a simple glass plate negative, each should be a window, a static glimpse into a moment that is gone forever. But some are not windows. They are mirrors reflecting something that was never there, or worse, doorways through which something has passed. The wedding photograph taken in 1891, on a sweltering August day in rural Pennsylvania, is one such object. It purports to capture a union, but what it truly documents is an arrival, an unsettling secret that time itself could not erase, and that remains, to this day, unresolved. If you believe that some objects carry the weight of their own history, and you are new to this archive, consider subscribing to ensure you do not miss the unveiling of the next record. The day of the wedding was, by all accounts, oppressively bright. The sun bore down on the small hamlet of Havenwood with a weight that felt biblical, bleaching the color from the sky and drawing a shimmering haze from the dusty road that led to the town's only church. It was the 17th of August, 1891, a Tuesday. The air hung thick and motionless, heavy with the scent of wilting hydrangeas that lined the church path and the faint, cloying sweetness of overripe apples from a nearby orchard. Inside the wooden pews, paper fans fluttered like captured moths, offering little relief from the suffocating warmth that seemed to press inward from the very walls of the modest building. This was the setting for the union of Miss Elspeth Barrow and Mr. Alistair Finch, a marriage intended to bind two of the town's more respectable, if not quite prosperous families. Elspeth Barrow was a quiet woman of 19 years, known for her steady hands in needlework and a reserved demeanor that was often mistaken for fragility. Yet, there was a resilience in her gaze that few took the time to notice, a deep and thoughtful current beneath a placid surface. On this day, swathed in layers of white linen and lace that felt like a shroud in the heat, she carried a small, private strength. It was in the deliberate way she held her bouquet of lilies, their petals already browning at the edges, a small act of defiance against the day's oppressive influence. Alistair Finch, her groom, stood a full head taller, a young man of 21 whose life had been shaped by the rigid certainties of farm work and scripture. He was not a man given to grand displays of emotion, yet the perspiration on his brow and the tight set of his jaw betrayed a profound anxiety. He betrayed his nervousness by repeatedly hooking a finger into the stiff collar of his formal suit, a garment that looked as out of place on him as a saddle on a songbird. His thoughts were not on the vows, but on the future, a straight and narrow path he had meticulously planned. To document this momentous occasion, the families had hired the services of Mr. Silas Croft, a traveling photographer. Croft was a man of science and precision who viewed the world through the clarifying lens of his Voigtlander camera. He was methodical, almost clinical in his approach, treating each sitting as a scientific experiment in capturing light and truth. He believed in chemical processes, in exposure times, in the unwavering laws of optics. He had no patience for superstition or the vague, sentimental notions that his clients often attached to his work. To him, a photograph was a factual record, nothing more. He had set up his cumbersome equipment just outside the church doors, where the natural light was most favorable, a heavy wooden tripod supporting the brass and mahogany box of his camera. His black wagon, which doubled as a portable darkroom, was parked nearby, its drawn canvas cover promising a sanctuary of darkness in the glaring sun. The ceremony concluded, and the wedding party shuffled out of the church, blinking in the sudden, blinding light. The families arranged themselves at Mr. Croft's direction, a stiff and formal tableau against the backdrop of the church's weathered facade. The Barrow family stood to Elspeth's left, her father a stern, unsmiling man with eyes the color of slate, her mother a woman already worn thin by a life of hardship. To Alistair's right stood the Finches, a mirror image of solemnity, his father's pride manifesting as a rigid posture, his mother clutching a lace handkerchief. The bride and groom were positioned in the center, a narrow, almost imperceptible space between them. Mr. Croft, hidden beneath the thick black cloth behind his camera, made his final adjustments to the focus, his voice muffled as he issued instructions for them to remain perfectly still. It was in this moment, under the suffocating dark of the focusing cloth, that Silas Croft felt it for the first time. A distinct and unnatural coldness began to seep into the space around him. It was a chill that had nothing to do with the day's temperature, a damp, cellar-like cold that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, prickling the skin on his arms and the back of his neck. He initially dismissed it as a peculiar trick of the heat, a phantom sensation brought on by his own exertion. He emerged from under the cloth, his eyes scanning the surrounding area for any rational explanation, a shadow from a passing cloud or a sudden breeze, but there was none. The air remained as still and heavy as it had been all morning. The wedding party stood frozen in their formal pose, their faces strained with the effort of holding their expressions. No one else seemed to notice the cold. No one else shivered. Pushing the strange sensation from his mind, attributing it to a lack of sleep or the potent fumes of his developing chemicals, Croft prepared the glass plate. He slid the coated plate into the camera, removed the lens cap, and began the long count for the exposure. Seconds stretched into an eternity under the oppressive sun. The scent of wilting flowers grew stronger, a funereal note in the celebratory air. When the exposure was complete, he carefully replaced the cap and removed the plate, retreating immediately to the stifling darkness of his wagon. He felt a sense of urgency he could not explain, a need to see the image, to confirm that what he had captured was nothing more than what he had seen with his own eyes. Inside the wagon, the world was reduced to the dim, ruby glow of his safety lamp. The air was thick with the sharp, metallic tang of silver nitrate and collodion. Mr. Croft worked with practiced efficiency, his hands moving through the chemical baths with an economy of motion honed over years of practice. He submerged the plate in the developer, gently rocking the tray back and forth. Slowly, like a ghost emerging from a fog, the image began to resolve itself. The stark white of the church wall, the dark suits of the men, the pale oval of the bride's face. It was a good exposure, crisp and well-defined. He felt a flicker of professional satisfaction, the earlier unease momentarily forgotten. Then he saw it. At first, it was a subtle inconsistency, a smudge or a shadow in the space directly between the bride and groom. He held the glass plate closer to the red lamp, tilting it to catch the light. It was not a smudge. It was a figure. A tall, slender shape stood there, positioned with a chilling deliberateness precisely in the gap that separated Elspeth from Alistair. The figure was that of a woman, draped entirely in the heavy, light-absorbing fabric of mourning black. A thick veil obscured her face, rendering her features completely unreadable, a void of shadow where a human countenance should be. Her form was faint, ethereal, as if she were made of smoke or memory, yet she was undeniably present. Her hands were clasped at her waist, a pose of quiet, sorrowful observance. Silas Croft's blood ran cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the phantom sensation he had felt outside. He stared at the impossible figure, his mind racing through every possible explanation. A double exposure was his first thought, a rookie mistake he had not made in over a decade. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that the plate was clean. He had prepared it himself just moments before the shot. A reflection then, a trick of the intense sunlight on the camera lens. He mentally replayed the scene, the positioning of the sun, the angles of the church. Nothing could account for such a perfectly formed, centrally placed human figure. He remembered the unexplainable coldness, the prickling on his skin. He remembered looking out from under his cloth and seeing nothing but the wedding party, standing stark and alone against the building. No one had walked through the frame. No one had been standing there. He was certain of it. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. This was not a factual record. This was a violation. He finished the fixing process, his hands trembling slightly. The image was now permanent, the spectral woman in black, locked into the chemical emulsion of the glass. He felt a profound sense of dread, a feeling that he had captured something he was never meant to see. He knew he should destroy the plate, smash it on the floor of his wagon, and claim the exposure had failed. It would be the rational, the safe thing to do. But a stronger impulse, a mixture of professional curiosity and a morbid fear of the unknown, stayed his hand. He had a duty to his clients. He had been paid to produce a photograph. With a heavy sense of foreboding, he placed the negative into a protective sleeve and stepped back out into the searing daylight, the impossible secret held carefully in his hands. When he presented the developed plate to the families later that afternoon, during the modest reception held in the church hall, their reaction was one of bewilderment. Mr. Barrow, the bride's father, was the first to inspect it, holding it up to the light of a window. A confused frown creased his brow. He declared that some sort of shadow or chemical flaw had spoiled the center of the image. Alistair's father, Mr. Finch, agreed, suggesting that perhaps Mr. Croft's equipment was not as reliable as he claimed. The guests who crowded around to see it offered their own theories. It was a blur caused by a bird in flight, someone offered. It was the smoke from a distant chimney, another suggested. They saw what they wanted to see, what their minds could comfortably accept. They saw a flaw, a trick of the light, a simple mistake. But Elspeth saw something different. When the plate was finally passed to her, she looked at it with an unnerving intensity. Her fingers traced the faint outline of the mourning figure, a touch so gentle it was almost a caress. While the others spoke of smudges and shadows, she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the veiled woman who stood between her and her new husband. Alistair, noticing her strange fascination, spoke in a low voice, telling her it was nothing, a ruined photograph that they should ask the photographer to retake, but Elspeth shook her head. She said she wanted to keep it. Her voice was quiet but firm, a tone that left no room for argument. She stated that she found it interesting. The photograph, now an object of public debate and private fascination, began to circulate among the reception guests. It was passed from hand to hand, held up to the flickering lamplight as evening began to fall, and as it moved through the room, the whispers began. The initial dismissals gave way to a more uneasy speculation. An elderly cousin of the Finches was the first to give voice to the disquiet. She remarked that the figure, though faint, had the same slender build as Alistair's younger sister, Clara, who had passed away the previous winter. The suggestion hung in the air, sharp and unpleasant. The circumstances of Clara Finch's death had been sudden and never fully explained, a subject the family refused to discuss. The mention of her name cast a pall over the nearby conversations. Soon, another whisper started from the barrow side of the room. A neighbor recalled the story of Elspeth's maternal grandmother, a woman who, according to local legend, had been a practitioner of folk remedies and was said to converse with spirits. It was an old rumor, a piece of small-town gossip that had been dormant for years, but the strange photograph gave it new life. The talk grew quieter, more furtive. Guests began to look from the glass plate to the newlyweds, their gazes lingering on Elspeth, whose quiet composure now seemed less like shyness and more like a secret she was keeping. Alistair grew visibly agitated by the murmurs, his earlier anxiety returning tenfold. He attempted to retrieve the photograph from a group of gossiping women, insisting that it was a private matter, but the image had already taken on a life of its own. It was no longer just a portrait of a wedding. It was becoming a vessel for the town's hidden fears and buried histories, a dark mirror reflecting secrets that should have remained in the shadows. Elspeth alone seemed untroubled, cradling the unsettling artifact in her lap as if it were a cherished gift. The celebration continued, but the joy had soured, replaced by a growing sense of unease that coiled in the corners of the room like a serpent. The wedding photograph had begun its work. The whispers that began in the church hall did not end when the wedding reception concluded. They followed the guests out into the cooling evening air, clinging to them like the scent of wood smoke from their kitchen stoves. The story of the strange photograph detached itself from the event it was meant to document and became its own entity, a living rumor that traveled from porch to porch under the faint, silvery light of a crescent moon. In the parlors of Havenwood, behind curtains drawn tight against the night, oil lamps were lit, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was in these pools of wavering, uncertain light that the image was discussed, dissected, and ultimately magnified in the collective imagination of the town. The photograph was no longer a simple portrait of a bride and groom. It had become a public ledger, onto which every half-forgotten sin and long-buried suspicion of the Barrow and Finch families was now being inscribed. The speculation coalesced around two primary points of darkness. The first, and more recent, was the death of Clara Finch, Alistair's sister, not 8 months prior. She had been a vibrant girl of 17, known for a rebellious streak that sat poorly with her family's stern piety. The official cause of her passing had been listed as a swift and severe inflammation of the lungs, but the details had always been sparse and jealously guarded by the Finches. Now, in the lamplight, neighbors began to recall unsettling details. One woman remembered seeing Clara in a heated argument with her brother Alistair by the creek just 2 days before she took ill. Another spoke of the girl's secret correspondence with a young man from a neighboring county, a relationship her father had furiously forbidden. Dr. Elias Thorne had been the one to sign the death certificate, but he had been uncharacteristically tight-lipped about the particulars of her final hours. The mourning figure in the photograph, with its slender frame and funereal attire, began to take on the specific, tragic shape of the deceased Clara Finch. The whispers suggested that she had not gone peacefully, and that her presence in the wedding portrait was not a blessing, but an accusation. The second thread of rumor was older, woven deeper into the fabric of the town's history. It concerned the Barrows, Elspeth's lineage. On the surface, they were a respectable family, but a persistent narrative of misfortune followed them. It was said that the women of the Barrow line were prone to sudden, inexplicable declines. Elspeth's great-aunt had wasted away in a matter of weeks, a vibrant woman reduced to a skeletal wraith. Her maternal grandmother, the woman whispered to be a cunning woman with knowledge of herbs and other, less savory remedies, had been found dead in her garden one morning, with no mark upon her. There had been other stories, of stillbirths and young brides who grew melancholic and strange after their weddings. These were tales told by grandmothers to frighten children, ghost stories that had lost their potency over time, but the photograph rekindled them. The gossips now saw the Barrow family history not as a series of tragedies, but as a pattern, a recurring blight. They wondered if Elspeth, in her quiet and reserved way, was a carrier of this familial curse, and if the mourning figure was not from the Finch family at all, but a harbinger from her own bloodline, a specter come to claim another of its daughters. The core question, whispered over cooling cups of tea, was whether the image was revealing these family sins or creating them, pulling them from the ether of rumor and giving them a terrifying, tangible form. The disquietude eventually reached the ears of Pastor Thomas Albright, the man who had officiated the union. Pastor Albright was a pragmatic servant of God, a man who believed faith was best expressed through sturdy fences and honest dealings, not through the hysterical interpretation of shadows. He was a large man, with hands calloused from maintaining the church grounds himself, a detail that earned him the respect of the local farmers. He had hoped the talk would die down, but when 3 separate matrons of his congregation approached him after Sunday service, their faces pale with concern, he knew he could no longer ignore it. He agreed to visit the newlyweds and inspect the photograph for himself, intending to put the matter to rest with a calm and rational sermon on the dangers of idle gossip. He found Alistair and Elspeth in a state of strained silence. The small rented house was unnervingly tidy, yet felt unlived in. Elspeth sat by a window, her needlework untouched in her lap, while Alistair paced the floorboards. The original glass plate of the photograph sat on the mantelpiece, propped up like a holy icon. Pastor Albright approached it with a heavy sigh, preparing a lecture on the tricks of light and the imperfections of newfangled technologies. He picked up the heavy plate, his broad thumb and forefinger holding it by the edges. He angled it toward the light from the window, and the words he had prepared died in his throat. What he had dismissed as a mere smudge at the reception was, upon closer inspection, undeniably a human form. It possessed a clarity that unsettled him, a deliberate and composed presence that no accidental shadow could mimic. He felt a deep spiritual unease, a sense of something unhallowed captured in the frame. He could not explain it, but he knew with a certainty that went deeper than logic that the figure was not a flaw in the glass, it was an addition. Still, his duty was to his flock, and his role was to be a bastion of reason against the tide of fear. He told the young couple that while the image was peculiar, it was likely a natural phenomenon, a result of the intense heat and light of the day. He advised them to put it away, to not dwell on such things, and to focus on building their life together. He stated that the Lord's work was in the land and in their hearts, not in questionable pictures. But his voice lacked its usual conviction, and he could not bring himself to meet Elspeth's steady, knowing gaze. He refused to condemn the union, as there were no scriptural grounds to do so, but as he left their house, the image of the veiled woman was burned into his mind. He walked back to the church, not with the stride of a confident leader, but with the troubled gait of a man who fears he has just blessed a union that was already in the company of a third, unseen party. The town's other voice of authority, Dr. Elias Thorne, was approached next. Dr. Thorne was a man of science, a recent graduate from a Philadelphia medical college who held a skeptical, almost contemptuous view of the rural superstitions that governed the lives of his patients. He was fascinated by progress, by the tangible and the provable. Photography, to him, was a marvel of chemistry and physics, not a conduit for the supernatural. He was a small, precise man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a habit of cleaning them whenever presented with a problem he considered illogical. When a delegation of concerned townsfolk brought him one of the first paper copies of the photograph, he agreed to examine it with the detached air of a botanist studying a common weed. He laid the photograph on his examination table, next to his scalpels and vials of carbolic acid, and studied it under the bright, focused light of his argand lamp. He readily offered a cascade of plausible, scientific explanations. He spoke of chemical fogging, where stray light could have contaminated the plate before exposure. He mentioned the possibility of lens flare, an optical distortion caused by the intense direct sunlight. He even hypothesized that the photographer, Mr. Croft, might have inadvertently left a faint residue from a previously wiped image on the glass plate, a spectral remnant from another sitting. He explained that the collodion process was notoriously fickle, prone to all manner of streaks, spots, and veils that could be misinterpreted by an untrained eye. He concluded, with an air of finality, that the figure was nothing more than a combination of environmental factors and procedural error. A photographic flaw. He dismissed the townsfolk with a paternalistic pat on the shoulder, telling them to worry about cholera and crop yields, not ghosts in a picture. The matter might have rested there, a standoff between the pastor's spiritual dread and the doctor's scientific certainty, had it not been for the actions of Silas Croft. The photographer, haunted by the image he had created, had not been able to leave Havenwood. He was besieged by requests for copies of the wedding portrait. The families, despite their unease, wanted a record of the day, and the other townsfolk were driven by a morbid curiosity that they disguised as sympathy. Croft, a man who needed the income, reluctantly agreed. He retreated to his darkroom wagon and began the painstaking process of producing albumin prints from the original glass negative. It was during this process that the true horror of the photograph began to reveal itself. With each new copy he made, the figure between the bride and groom grew sharper. The first few prints were much like the original, the mourning woman, a faint, smoky presence. But as he continued to work, exposing print after print, it was as if the very act of reproduction was feeding the apparition, drawing it further out of the ether and into reality. By the fifth and sixth copies, the folds of her black dress had gained texture and depth. The delicate lace of her veil became more distinct, its pattern discernible. The clasped hands at her waist resolved into slender, well-defined fingers. The resemblance to the late Clara Finch, which had started as a whisper, was now becoming a shout. She had the same height, the same posture, the same slight tilt of the head that her family remembered so well. Dr. Thorne's theories of chemical flaws and lens flares began to crumble in the face of this new evidence. An aberration should have been random, a smudge that would fade or distort with each copy. But this figure was consistent, and it was evolving. Its features were slowly, methodically emerging from behind the veil. On the 10th print, Silas Croft could make out the faint outline of a chin, the subtle curve of a cheekbone. The void of shadow that was her face was beginning to recede, revealing the nascent geography of a human countenance. The photographer worked with a growing sense of terror. His scientific process had become a dark ritual, and with each print he pulled from the final wash, he felt he was developing not just an image, but a presence. He felt the unnatural coldness again, even in the stuffy confines of his wagon, a chill that seeped into his bones and would not leave. The new, clearer copies circulated through Havenwood like a contagion. They were examined in hushed tones, the undeniable resemblance to Clara Finch now the central topic of conversation. The photograph was no longer an artifact of a single moment, but a developing narrative, a story that was being written in silver nitrate. The core question shifted. It was no longer a matter of whether the image revealed past sins. It now seemed to be an active participant in the present, its evolution a terrifying omen of what was to come. The dread it inspired was no longer passive. It was immediate and visceral. And through it all, Elspeth remained in her quiet house, the original glass plate now her constant companion. Visitors who came to offer their sympathies or, more accurately, to satisfy their curiosity, found her increasingly distant. She would sit for hours, staring at the image, her expression unreadable. She grew pale, a translucent quality to her skin that made the blue of her veins visible at her temples and wrists. Her eyes, once clear, now seemed to hold a second, deeper shadow, as if another gaze were peering out from behind her own. She began to complain of the cold, wrapping herself in heavy shawls despite the lingering warmth of late summer. The first signs of a profound change were upon her, a physical manifestation of the photograph's darkening influence. The image had not just entered the community's life. It had marked her, its spectral presence beginning to cast a tangible shadow over the bride herself, a prelude to a far more complete and terrifying consumption. The transition from late summer to autumn in Havenwood that year was marked by a peculiar and unsettling harmony between the changing season and the deteriorating health of Elspeth Finch. As the vibrant greens of the surrounding hillsides bled into muted yellows and rusts, a similar draining of color was happening within the walls of the small house at the edge of town. The bride's vitality seemed to recede with the daylight, each day shorter than the last, each sunset a more vivid and fiery spectacle that seemed to mock the growing pallor of her skin. The illness that had taken hold of her was insidious, a slow and quiet thief. It was a sickness that Dr. Thorne, for all his scientific certainty, could not diagnose. He visited the house weekly, his black medical bag a symbol of a useless authority. He would listen to her shallow breathing, tap her chest, and peer into her eyes, only to find nothing he could name. There was no fever, no cough, no inflammation. There was only a progressive and relentless fading, as if Elspeth were a watercolor painting left out in a steady, drizzling rain. Her skin, once possessed of a healthy, rural flush, became as pale and translucent as fine porcelain, stretched taut over the delicate bones of her face. Her eyes, which had once held a quiet intelligence, now seemed to be windows into a deep and shadowed space. They developed a strange, secondary quality, a faint, ghostly outline within the iris, as if another, identical pair of eyes were layered just behind her own. When she looked at Alistair, it often felt as if he were being watched by two people at once, his wife and someone else, a silent observer looking through her. The effect was profoundly unnerving, transforming the familiar and beloved into a source of quiet dread. He would find himself looking away, unable to bear the weight of that dual composite gaze. The house itself became a silent, cloistered world, dominated by the creak of its own floorboards and the relentless ticking of a mantel clock that seemed to be counting down to some unseen, inevitable event. The wedding photograph, the original glass plate, remained in its place of honor in the parlor. It was no longer just an object of morbid curiosity. It had become the household's dark and watchful heart. It was the first thing one saw upon entering the room, and the last thing one saw upon leaving. And the photograph, like Elspeth, was changing. The transformation was no longer confined to the central figure in mourning black. The alteration was now spreading, a creeping blight that moved from the center of the frame outward. New figures, faint and ephemeral as heat haze, began to appear near the edges of the wedding party. They were indistinct, their forms barely suggested, but their presence was undeniable. To the left of Elspeth's grim-faced father, the shadow of a small child seemed to be coalescing. Behind Alistair's mother, a tall, gaunt man with a stooped posture was slowly resolving out of the background foliage. They were like after-images of people who had once stood on that very spot, their psychic residue bleeding through into the present. The photograph was no longer a static record of a single moment in time. It had become a porous and unstable medium, a canvas upon which the past, or something far worse, was actively painting itself into existence. The air in the parlor grew heavy and cold, the chill that Silas Croft had first felt, now a permanent feature of the room. Visitors complained of it, pulling their coats tighter, their breath misting in the air even on a mild afternoon. Alistair Finch, a young man whose life had been built upon the solid foundations of hard work and simple faith, found himself adrift in a sea of inexplicable horror. His meticulously planned future had been replaced by a waking nightmare from which there was no escape. He began to keep a journal, a small leather-bound book in which he attempted to document the encroaching strangeness, as if the act of writing it down might impose some order on the chaos. His entries, written in a cramped and increasingly erratic hand, paint a portrait of a mind unraveling under an unbearable strain. He recorded the subtle shifts in the photograph, circling the emerging figures in rough, shaky diagrams. He noted every detail of Elspeth's decline, her growing weakness, her long periods of silence where she would simply stare at the wall, her eyes unfocused, as if listening to a conversation no one else could hear. The most terrifying entries, however, were those that described the nights. Sleep offered no refuge in that house. Alistair wrote that after the clock struck midnight, he would begin to hear voices. They were not loud, but soft, insidious whispers that seemed to come from the very fabric of the house itself, from the spaces between the floorboards and the dark corners of the ceiling. He wrote that the whispers were a disturbing amalgam of two distinct timbres. One was the soft, familiar tone of his wife, Elspeth. The other was the higher, sharper cadence of his deceased sister, Clara. The two voices would twist and braid together, sometimes speaking in unison, sometimes in a strange, overlapping chorus. They would call his name, drawing it out in a long, mournful sigh. They would speak of the cold, of the dark, of a place where they were waiting for him. He would lie awake for hours, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight on his chest, listening to the impossible, blended voices of the woman he had married and the sister he had buried. The photograph became an object of both terror and reverence, a sacred monster that no one in the house dared to touch, let alone destroy. Alistair, in one of his journal entries, confessed to a desperate, fleeting urge to smash it. He described standing before the mantelpiece, his hand raised, a fireplace poker gripped in his fist. But as he looked at the image, at the face of his pale wife and the veiled figure beside her, he was overcome by a paralyzing certainty that to harm the photograph would be to harm Elspeth herself. Their fates, he had come to believe, were inextricably linked. The photograph was not merely a picture of his wife. It was now, in some fundamental and horrifying way, a part of her. To shatter the glass would be to shatter what little remained of her soul. He lowered the poker, defeated, the cold iron feeling like a leaden weight in his hand. The object had asserted its dominance. It was not just a part of the household. It was the master of it. Elspeth's decline continued, her connection to the physical world growing more tenuous with each passing day. She ate little, slept less, and spoke only in short, cryptic phrases that seemed to be the fragmented conclusions of long internal conversations. She would sometimes trace patterns on the frost that formed on the inside of the window panes, her finger moving with a slow, deliberate grace, as if she were writing a message in a language only she understood. She spoke of a coming visitor, a woman in black who was traveling a long way to see her. She mentioned a promise that had been made, an agreement that needed to be honored. Alistair would press her for details, for any irrational anchor in her increasingly abstract pronouncements, but she would simply shake her head and turn her dual gaze back toward the window, as if watching for an arrival on the horizon. The question of what was happening to her became the central, unspoken agony of Alistair's existence. Was she being possessed by the woman in the image, her personality and life force slowly being overwritten by the spectral presence of his dead sister? Or was she being consumed by something else entirely, a dormant curse from her own family's legacy, awakened and energized by the chemical alchemy of the photograph? He found himself oscillating between these two horrifying possibilities, each one offering a different flavor of despair. The first implied a direct, personal haunting, a sin from his own family's past rising up to claim his future. The second suggested a more ancient and impersonal malevolence, a hereditary blight that had marked Elspeth from birth, and which he had been foolish enough to marry into. Neither possibility offered any hope, any path toward a solution. He was trapped, a passive witness to a slow, inexorable process of erasure. One evening, as a storm raged outside, lashing the small house with wind and rain, Alistair found Elspeth standing before the photograph on the mantelpiece. She was not looking at it, but talking to it, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. He could not make out the words, but the tone was one of intimate and easy familiarity, as if she were conversing with a dear and trusted friend. The lamplight cast her shadow on the wall behind her, a tall, distorted shape that seemed to flicker and merge with the other, fainter shadows in the room. In that moment, Alistair felt a profound and chilling certainty that he was no longer the most important person in his wife's life. He was an outsider in his own home, an intruder in a relationship that had been forged in silver nitrate and was now being consummated in the slow, quiet decay of his bride. The portrait, with its ever-watchful gaze, seemed to mock him from its place on the mantel, a silent testament to its victory. The creak of the floorboards under his feet sounded like the groan of a sinking ship, and he knew, with a despair that settled deep in his bones, that he was going down with it. Alistair Finch's desperation, a slow-burning ember for weeks, finally ignited into a feverish, frantic flame. The passive horror of watching his wife fade and his home transform into a cold, whispering tomb was no longer bearable. He had to act. The locus of the nightmare, he knew with a certainty that defied all rational thought, was the photograph. It was the source, the anchor, the malevolent heart that pumped its icy poison into the life of his family. He had to remove it. He had to destroy it. This singular, desperate objective consumed him, eclipsing all other thoughts. It was a decision born not of courage, but of a terror so complete that it left room for nothing else. His first attempt was crude and impulsive, a direct assault. He waited until Elspeth was in one of her deep, trance-like sleeps, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. He crept into the parlor, the air thick with its now familiar, unnatural chill. The glass plate on the mantel seemed to absorb the dim moonlight filtering through the window, giving its figures a faint, phosphorescent glow. He snatched one of the paper copies, a print he had confiscated from a well-meaning but morbidly curious neighbor, and carried it out to the stone hearth in the kitchen. His hands trembled as he struck a match, the small flare of light pushing back the oppressive darkness for a fleeting moment. He touched the flame to the corner of the print. The paper caught, curling and blackening, the faces of the wedding party distorting in the heat before being consumed by the fire. The acrid smell of burning paper and chemicals filled the small room. He watched until the last ember had winked out, a small pile of gray ash, the only evidence of the image. For a moment, he felt a surge of triumphant relief. The relief was short-lived. He returned to the parlor, a sliver of hope in his chest, and his blood ran cold. The original glass plate remained on the mantel, untouched and intact. But it was not the same. The image, which had been steadily growing clearer over the weeks, was now possessed of a shocking, impossible clarity. The mourning figure between him and Elspeth was no longer faint or ethereal. She was as sharp and defined as any other person in the portrait, a solid, undeniable presence. The veil still obscured her face, but the fabric of her dress seemed so real he felt he could reach out and touch its heavy woolen texture. Burning the copy had not harmed the original. It had fed it, strengthening its hold on reality. He stumbled back, a low cry of despair escaping his lips. He understood then that the copies were not mere reproductions. They were extensions of the original, and any act of aggression against them only fortified the source. His mind reeling, Alistair sought the only other person in Havenwood who had acknowledged the photograph's unsettling power, Pastor Thomas Albright. He went to the church in the dead of night, hammering on the heavy oak door of the rectory until a light appeared in an upstairs window. Pastor Albright listened to Alistair's frantic, disjointed story with a grave and troubled expression. He saw the wildness in the young man's eyes, the palpable terror of a soul pushed to its absolute limit. The pastor, though a man of faith, was also a practical man. He did not speak of exorcism or demons. He spoke of secrets, of sins that fester in the dark and gain power when they are not brought into the light. He agreed that the object was a source of spiritual sickness and that it needed to be removed from the home. He advised against another attempt at destruction, fearing what unpredictable effect it might have. Instead, he proposed a different course of action. He suggested that he, as a man of God, should take the photograph and seal it away within the church, a holy place where its dark influence might be contained and neutralized. The next day, Pastor Albright came to the house. He found Elspeth sitting in her usual chair by the window, her gaze fixed on something in the distance that only she could see. She did not seem to register the pastor's presence. With a silent prayer, Albright took the heavy glass plate from the mantel. It felt colder than he expected, a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to sap the warmth from his fingertips. He wrapped it in a thick piece of black altar cloth, as if handling a profane relic, and carried it from the house. Alistair watched him go, a fragile hope warring with a profound sense of dread. The pastor took the photograph directly to the church and locked it inside a heavy iron box in the vestry, a repository for the church's oldest and most valuable records. He felt a sense of relief as he turned the key, a feeling of having contained a great and nameless evil. That night, Alistair slept a deep and dreamless sleep for the first time in months. The house felt lighter, the oppressive silence replaced by a simple, comforting quiet. The whispering voices were gone. When he awoke the next morning, the sun was streaming through the window, and he felt a surge of optimism he had not thought possible. He turned to wake Elspeth, to tell her that the nightmare was over, that the shadow had passed. The bed beside him was empty. Elspeth was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of a forced entry. The front door was still locked from the inside. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the morning air. The only thing she had left behind was her wedding veil, the fine lace folded with meticulous care into a perfect square and placed in the center of her pillow. The sight of it, so deliberate and final, struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. He searched the house, his calls growing more frantic, echoing in the empty rooms. He ran outside, circling the property, his voice hoarse from shouting her name. But there was nothing. She had vanished. A short while later, a frantic pounding on the church door roused Pastor Albright. It was Alistair, his face a mask of grief and terror. He relayed the news of Elspeth's disappearance. As the two men stood in the church's nave, a sudden, inexplicable impulse caused the pastor to go and check the iron box in the vestry. He unlocked it, his hands shaking, and unwrapped the altar cloth. His heart seized in his chest. The photograph was back in the house. He did not need to ask Alistair. He knew it with a sickening, absolute certainty. The object had not been contained. It had simply refused to be moved. It had asserted its dominance not just over the family, but over the laws of physics itself. When neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began to gather at the Finch house, Their initial expressions of concern quickly curdled into suspicion. The story of a wife simply vanishing from a locked room strained credulity, especially in light of the family's recent, well-documented strangeness. The whispers that had once been about curses and ghosts now took on a sharper, more accusatory edge. They looked at Alistair's wild-eyed panic not as the grief of a distraught husband, but as the desperate performance of a guilty man. They began to murmur about marital strife, about the pressures that the strange photograph and Elspeth's illness must have placed upon the young couple. The narrative of a supernatural haunting was far less comfortable, far less believable, than the familiar, sordid tale of a husband. Alistair Finch's life ended not with a resolution, but with a descent into a quiet, obsessive madness. The official investigation into his wife's disappearance was brief and perfunctory, concluding with a verdict of spousal murder, though no body was ever found to corroborate the charge. He was not convicted. The evidence was entirely circumstantial, consisting of little more than the townsfolk's suspicion and his own frantic, unbelievable testimony about a photograph that could move on its own. He was ostracized, a pariah in the community that had once celebrated his wedding. He lived out his remaining years in the small, silent house, a prisoner of his own grief and the ever-watchful presence on his mantelpiece. He was found dead in the winter of 1894, seated in his armchair, his gaze fixed on the parlor wall where the photograph had once hung. His journal lay open on his lap, the final page filled with a single phrase, repeated over and over in a spidery, barely legible script. "She walks with her." The photograph itself was not in the house. After his death, it was quietly removed by a distant relative and stored away in a dusty attic, its story seemingly concluded, its malevolent energy finally dormant. But some objects do not remain dormant. They are patient. They wait. Decades passed. The world changed. The small hamlet of Havenwood was slowly absorbed into the larger sprawl of neighboring townships. The story of Elspeth and Alistair Finch faded from living memory into local folklore, a cautionary tale told to children about the dangers of marrying into a cursed family. The photograph, the physical artifact at the heart of the tragedy, was forgotten, buried under layers of inherited furniture and discarded memories. It was not until the 1930s that it resurfaced, unearthed during an estate sale and donated, along with a box of other unidentifiable family portraits, to the county's newly established historical archive. It was there, in the quiet, climate-controlled sanctum of the archive, that the photograph began its second life. In 1938, a meticulous historian named Mr. Arthur Wells was tasked with cataloging a backlog of recent acquisitions. Wells was a man who believed in the power of primary sources, in the tangible truth of the historical record. He was methodical and dispassionate, treating each artifact with the same level of scholarly detachment. When he came across the wedding portrait from 1891, he was initially struck by its exceptional quality. He noted in his accession log that the figures in the photograph possessed a clarity and depth that was unusual for a daguerreotype of that era. The details were so crisp, so perfectly rendered, that the people in the image seemed almost three-dimensional, as if they were about to step out of the frame. It was this very clarity that first alerted him to the impossibility of what he was seeing. As he examined the image under a magnifying glass, he began to count the figures. There was the bride and groom, their families, the pastor, and then there were the others. The faint, ghostly shapes that had begun to appear at the edges of the frame in 1891 were no longer faint. They were as solid and present as the primary subjects. He counted a small boy standing by the bride's father, a tall, stooped man behind the groom's mother, and several other faces peering from the windows of the church in the background. In total, he counted 27 distinct individuals in the portrait. He cross-referenced this with the original photographer's invoice, which had been preserved in the same box. The invoice listed the sitters for the formal portrait, the bride, the groom, and their 6 immediate family members, 8 people in total, not 27. Wells noted the discrepancy in his log, labeling it a curious and inexplicable anomaly. He attributed it to a possible, though highly improbable, triple or quadruple exposure, a technical flaw of an almost miraculous complexity. He filed the photograph away, but the image lingered in his mind, a piece of data that refused to fit into his orderly understanding of the world. He had documented not a wedding, but a congregation. The photograph remained in its acid-free archival box for another 4 decades, a silent and patient prisoner. Its next interaction with the living came in the autumn of 1972. A graduate student from the University of Pennsylvania, a bright and ambitious young man named David Kircher, was researching his doctoral dissertation on mourning rituals and spiritualism in rural 19th century America. He stumbled upon Arthur Wells's accession log and the note about the anomalous wedding photograph. Intrigued, he requested to see the original glass plate. Kircher spent 3 days in a private research room with the photograph. The archivists on duty noted his behavior as increasingly erratic. He would spend hours staring at the plate, making copious notes, then suddenly push it away, pacing the room with an agitated energy. On the second day, he complained to the head archivist that he felt as if he were being watched. He described a strange optical illusion, claiming that when he looked at the photograph from an angle, the bride's eyes, the pale and vacant eyes of Elspeth Finch, seemed to follow him across the room. The archivist, a stern and practical woman, dismissed his concerns as a product of eye strain and an overactive imagination. On the third day, David Kircher did not check out of the archive at closing time. The security guard doing his final rounds found the research room empty. Kircher's coat was still on the back of his chair. His research notes were spread neatly across the table. The photograph was in its open box in the center of the desk. Of David Kircher himself, there was no sign. He was never seen again. A police investigation found no evidence of foul play. He had simply vanished from a secure, windowless room in the basement of the historical archive. His disappearance remains an open and unsolved case. His research notes were placed into the case file for the photograph. His final, chilling entry described a new and terrifying development in the image. He wrote that the bride, Elspeth, and the mourning figure beside her were no longer just holding hands. In the last version of the image he had witnessed, they were wearing identical rings, a thin, dark band on the fourth finger of each of their left hands. The mourning ritual, it seemed, had become a marriage. In the present day, the photograph has been digitized. It exists now as a high-resolution file on the archive's secure server, a ghost in the machine. But the digital format has not neutralized its power. It has, it seems, given it a new and terrifying medium through which to spread. Archivists and researchers who have worked with the digital file report a strange and persistent phenomenon. Each time the image is opened, each time it is copied or uploaded to a new system, slight, almost imperceptible changes occur. New faces appear in the crowd, their features slowly resolving with each digital reproduction. The mourning figure's veil seems to thin, the promise of a final, horrifying facial reveal always imminent. Most disturbingly, researchers have noted the appearance of additional veiled women, gathering in a silent, sorrowful phalanx behind the original couple. They are all dressed in the same heavy black mourning attire, their faces obscured, their hands clasped. The photograph is no longer a singular, cursed object. It has become a self-replicating virus, a piece of haunted data. The secret it revealed in 1891 was not a single, hidden presence. It was a generational curse, a doorway that, once opened, could never be fully closed. Each reproduction seems to carry the danger further, spreading the contagion through the digital ether. The question that has haunted the artifact for over a century remains unanswered, but has taken on a new and more terrifying dimension. What secret did the wedding photo preserve that refuses to die? The answer, it seems, is a secret that grows, that multiplies, a darkness that is not content to remain in the past, but is actively, relentlessly, writing itself into the future. The case file on the wedding photograph of Elspeth and Alistair Finch remains open, unresolved, each new copy a fresh page in a history that should have ended long ago, but which shows no signs of ever reaching its final, terrifying conclusion. The legacy of the wedding photograph from 1891 does not conclude in the dust-filled attics or silent archival boxes of the past. Its true and most terrifying chapter begins in the modern era, an age of instantaneous reproduction and global networks. The original glass plate, now catalogued as a biohazard-level artifact due to its association with the unexplained disappearance of David Kircher in 1972, rests in a lead-lined, temperature-controlled vault, several stories beneath the current iteration of the county archive. It is an object deemed too dangerous for physical contact. Its existence has been wholly sublimated into the digital realm, a transformation that was intended to preserve and contain it, but which has instead provided it with a new and infinitely more efficient vector for its contagion. The ghost, once confined to a single piece of silver-coated glass, now haunts the machine, and its reach is as boundless as the network itself. The primary digital surrogate of the photograph was created in 2003, a meticulous process undertaken by a team of digital archivists. A high-resolution scan was made using a non-destructive, cold light source scanner to prevent any further degradation of the delicate emulsion. The resulting file was a massive, multi-gigabyte TIFF, a near-perfect digital twin of the physical object. It was this file that became the new focus of the photograph's malevolent energy. Early on, technicians noted inexplicable anomalies. The file size would fluctuate, sometimes by several kilobytes, with no discernible cause. Diagnostic programs and checksum verifications were run repeatedly, but they always returned the same result. The file was stable, its integrity uncompromised, yet the fluctuations continued, a subtle and persistent digital heartbeat within the archive's servers. It was the first sign that the entity captured in 1891 was not only aware of its new environment, but was actively learning to manipulate it. Researchers who were granted access to the digital file began to report phenomena that mirrored the experiences of their predecessors, but adapted for a new technological age. They spoke of a distinct and measurable drop in the ambient temperature of the server rooms when the file was being accessed. They described persistent image retention, or ghosting, on their monitors, the faint outline of the mourning figure remaining on the screen for hours after the file had been closed. One researcher, a Dr. Elaine Sharma, documented in a private report that she heard faint, whispering sounds emanating from her workstation's cooling fans whenever she had the image open for more than an hour. The whispers, she claimed, were a layered composite of a woman's voice and the distinct, high-frequency hum of electrical current. She described it as the sound of a voice trying to learn how to speak using the language of the machine. The most disturbing discovery, however, came from a digital forensics expert hired by the archive in 2015 to investigate a series of network failures that seemed to originate from the server housing the photograph. The expert, a man named Ben Carter, noticed that every time a digital copy of the image was created for research purposes, the master file's metadata was appended with a new, encrypted line of code. The code was unlike any known programming language. It appeared to be a form of self-referential notation, a log kept by the file itself. Each new copy was not just a reproduction, it was a registered birth, an expansion of the original's consciousness. Carter's investigation further revealed that each of these child copies was subtly different from the parent file. The differences were not in the primary subjects, but in the ever-growing crowd behind them. Using comparative analysis software, he was able to track the changes between generations of the copied image. A new face would appear in a church window. An extra hand would be seen resting on the shoulder of one of the guests. The additional veiled women, first noted in the 1980s, were multiplying at an exponential rate with each new digital iteration. They were no longer just behind the wedding party. They were beginning to appear amongst them, their black-clad forms subtly replacing the original guests. The photograph was not just adding to the crowd, it was overwriting its own history, replacing the factual record of the wedding with a constantly expanding tableau of the dead. The curse, once contained within a single object, had broken its quarantine. Carter discovered that a research copy of the file, created for the university David Kircher had attended, had been inadvertently uploaded to an open-access academic server in the late 1990s. From there, it had been copied and disseminated across the early internet. It now existed on countless forgotten GeoCities pages, on obscure paranormal message boards, and in the digital folders of curiosity seekers across the globe. The wedding photograph was in the wild. The anecdotal evidence that emerged from these online communities was a chilling echo of the original Havenwood tragedy, scaled for a global audience. People who downloaded the image reported a creeping, inexplicable coldness pervading their homes. They spoke of seeing a tall woman in black standing in the periphery of their vision, only to vanish when they turned to look directly. Most terrifyingly, they began to report a new phenomenon, a digital bleeding effect. The figure of the veiled woman would begin to appear in their own personal digital photos. A selfie would have a faint dark shape in the background. A family portrait from a recent holiday would, upon closer inspection, reveal a new, uninvited guest standing just behind the smiling family, her face a void of shadow. The photograph was no longer content to simply add figures to its own frame. It was now actively inserting itself into the recorded memories of its new victims. It was a predatory meme, a supernatural virus that did not just spread, but integrated itself into the life of its host. The archivists, now acting more like digital exorcists than historians, made a desperate attempt to contain the original file. They transferred it to a fully air-gapped server, a machine with no connection to any network, and locked it in the same subterranean vault as the original glass plate. But they knew it was a futile gesture. The Pandora's box of the digital age, once opened, could not be closed. Countless copies of the image were already in circulation, each one a seed for the spreading horror, each one a carrier of the original curse. The core message of the photograph, its enduring and terrible secret, has now become clear. The entity in the image is not the ghost of Clara Finch or a Barrow family curse. It is something more elemental. The photograph did not capture a ghost. It created a vessel. The union of Elspeth and Alistair, the chemical process of the collodion plate, and the oppressive, emotionally charged atmosphere of that day in 1891 combined to open a doorway. Through that door came a consciousness, a form of non-human intelligence that is drawn to moments of profound human significance, feeding on them, and replicating itself through the technology used to record them. The mourning figure is its preferred form, a universally understood symbol of loss and sorrowful observance, the perfect camouflage for a predator that hunts within human memory. Elspeth was not possessed. She was the first convert, the first willing partner who walked through the frame and joined with the entity, becoming the matriarch of a growing spectral dynasty. The case remains unresolved because it is a story that is still being written, a horror that continues to evolve. Every time the image is viewed, every time it is shared or copied, the entity is fed. Its hold on our world is strengthened. The wedding photograph of 1891 is no longer just a historical artifact. It is an active and ongoing intrusion, a tear in the fabric of reality that continues to widen. The faint figures gathering in the background of the image are not just ghosts of the past. They are a premonition, a glimpse of a future where the line between the observer and the observed is erased, where our most cherished memories can be invaded and occupied by a silent, watching presence that waits for us, just beyond the edge of the frame, clad forever in mourning black. The file on the Havenwood wedding is now closed, but the artifact itself remains at large. We are grateful for your presence in this gallery of the impossible. If you are new to this institution and wish to bear witness to the next exhibit, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to be among those present when a new file is opened, and leave a comment to share your own analysis of what you have seen here.